Puddle Lane, the Wideawake Mice. Grandmother Mouse, Grandfather Mouse, Jeremy Mouse, Miranda Mouse, Uncle Maximus, Aunt Jane, Aunt Matilda. The Wideawake Mice. Mr. Wideawake kept a toy shop in Candletown. The toy shop wasn't far from Puddle Lane. There were all kinds of toys in the shop. There were toy soldiers and castles and a big red kite. There were dolls and boats and a beautiful rocking horse, and there was a large greeny brown egg. Mr. Wideawake's toy shop. Mr. Wideawake's toy shop. Open. A family of toy mice stood on a shelf in the toy shop, just under the counter where Mr. Wideawake took the money. There was Grandfather Mouse and there was Grandmother Mouse and Grandfather Mouse. Grandmother Mouse and Grandfather Mouse. There was Uncle Maximus and Aunt Matilda. Father Mouse and Mother Mouse had been sold before Christmas. Uncle Maximus and Aunt Matilda. There were two mouse children. They were called Jeremy Mouse and Miranda Mouse. Jeremy Mouse, Miranda Mouse. And then there was Aunt Jane. Jeremy and Miranda liked to look at Aunt Jane. She looked so cheerful and she looked so alive. But they couldn't say anything to her. They couldn't even move next to her. They were all toy mice standing on the shelf, and there was nothing they could do but stand there. And then one day, something happened which changed everything. Aunt Jane. The day was almost over. It was evening, and it was getting dark in the shop. Mr. Wideawake had just lit a lamp when the door of the shop opened, and an old man came in. He had white hair and very bright blue eyes. Mr. Wideawake didn't know it, but the old man was a magician. The magician lived in the old house at the end of Puddle Lane. The magician. Good evening, said Mr. Wideawake. What can I do for you? The magician pointed to the large greeny brown egg, which was on the counter. I should like to buy that, he said. The egg. Mr. Wideawake didn't really want to sell the egg. The egg costs a lot of money, he said. You don't know who might be inside it. It's very expensive. Why not buy a mouse instead? I'll take the egg, said the magician. He said it so firmly that Mr. Wideawake didn't say any more. He picked up the egg and made it into a parcel. Mr. Wideawake picked up the egg. The magician put his hand into his pocket, but when he pulled out his purse, he pulled out a little box too. It was a beautiful silver box, and it was full of silver dust. As the magician pulled out the box, the lid came open, and a little silver dust spilled out. The magician pulled out a little silver box. The dust floated downwards. It fell on the family of toy mice. The magic dust fell on the toy mice. The magician pushed the lid back on the box. He didn't see the magic dust which had fallen out. He put the box back in his pocket. He paid for the egg, picked up the parcel, and went out of the shop. The magician went out of the shop. Somewhere outside, a clock struck 6. 6 o'clock, said Mr. Wideawake. It's time for tea. Mr. Wideawake lived over his shop. He locked the door and he picked up the lamp. He left the shop and went upstairs for his tea. He didn't even glance at the family of little mice. Mr. Wideawake left the shop. It was very dark and still in the toy shop after Mr. Wideawake had gone. For some time, nothing happened. And then the moon shone in through the window. It shone on the family of little mice. As the moon shone on the magic dust began to shine. The moon shone on the toy mice. The moon shone on the magic dust. Grandfather Mouse stirred. He shook the magic dust from his head and took a step forward. I can move, he cried. I can talk too. So can I, said Grandmother Mouse. She sounded very surprised. Grandfather Mouse and Grandmother Mouse. I can move too, said Jeremy Mouse. I can talk, said Miranda. Jeremy and Miranda. We can all talk, said Aunt Jane. We can all move. The magician's dust was magic. It has made us come to life. What shall we do? Asked Grandmother Mouse. We can't go on standing here now we're alive. Aunt Jane and Grandmother Mouse. We'll go away, said Grandfather Mouse. We'll go off somewhere and find a house of our own. Don't leave us behind, cried Uncle Maximus. Of course we shan't leave you, said Grandfather Mouse. We shall all go together. He got down from the shelf and onto the floor. Grandfather Mouse got down. Aunt Jane saw a hole. Look, she said, there's a hole under the door. We could get through that. They all climbed down after Grandfather Mouse and went over to the hole. Aunt Jane crept through the hole first, and Miranda and Jeremy followed. Aunt Jane saw a hole. Then Grandmother Mouse went through the hole. Aunt Matilda crept through very carefully so as not to tear her dress. Uncle Maximus hurried after her. He didn't want to be left behind. It was a very tight fit for Uncle Maximus. He was a very large mouse, and he had to take his coat off to get through. Even then, he almost got stuck. But Grandfather pushed, and Aunt Jane pulled, and at last Uncle Maximus got out. Then Grandfather Mouse followed him. Aunt Jane pulled, and Uncle Maximus got out. When Mr. Wideawake came down into the shop next morning, the shelf was empty. The mice had gone. Burglars, cried Mr. Wideawake, looking at the empty shelf. Someone has stolen my mice. But the door was locked, and no one had broken the window. I must have sold them and forgotten all about it, said Mr. Wideawake. Mr. Wideawake in the shop.